I always prefer, after people have heard me at an unendurable length, to let dissenters go first, since the audience was remarkably respectful of me. If you have a dissenting question, maybe you can line up first. Do you have a dissenting question?
No.
Do you? Okay.
My question isn't necessarily dissenting, it's how you interpret it. Mm-hmm. You said that the conquest of territory by war is inadmissible according to the Geneva Agenda.
Not the Geneva.
The international law.
Yeah.
Jordan took over the West Bank. Egypt took over Gaza. Mm-hmm. The indigenous Palestinian Arabs had no state at that time. Those lines of 1967 reflect that those are armistice lines at the end of the War of Independence. They're not borders. And why isn't the territory that Jordan conquered inadmissible also as according to international law?
Okay. The question that's asked is, for those of you who aren't familiar with the background, in 1947, as I said, the United Nations passes the Partition Resolution stipulating a Jewish state and an Arab state in what's called British-mandated Palestine. By the end of the war, part of the territory which was designated for the Palestinian state was absorbed by Israel, and part of the territory that was designated for the Palestinian state was absorbed by Jordan, and part of it was absorbed by Egypt. And the question that was put to me is, why wasn't that illegitimate? Well, as a matter of fact, it was illegitimate. The Jordanian absorption of the West Bank was only recognized by two countries in the world, Great Britain and Pakistan. And Egypt never annexed the West Gaza. It had territorial jurisdiction over it, but it never annexed the Gaza. Now, if you want to question those borders and you want to call them armistice lines, as you put it, the 1949 borders, then bear in mind what you're saying. Because as you well know, you're apparently versed in the history. As you well know, Israel was allotted 56% of Palestine. By the end of the war in 49, it had 80% of Palestine. So there is one exception in the world. We have one exception where acquisition of territory by war has been accepted by the international community. Do you know what the one exception is? The exception is Israel's annexation of that land, which was not designated for a Jewish state in 1948. Now, if you want to reject those armistice borders, then you have to then be open to the prospect of Israel going back to 56% of Palestine. Do you want that? I didn't hear any Israelis supporting that. So those who support Israel should be very cautious about questioning those armistice borders of 49, because that means Israel may actually get less. Mm-hmm. Yes?
You noted that in many of the votes in the United Nations that Israel and the other major countries in the United States takes the rejectionist view. Mm-hmm. Given that, would you comment on the article by Mearsheimer and Walt and the role that AIPAC plays in all of this issue? What's your take on that?
Okay. The question that's asked to me is the following. I want to try to bring everybody into the discussion because sometimes there are references to things you may not be familiar with in specific, but you know the issue in general. There are two professors, one named John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago and another named Stephen Walt from the Harvard Kennedy School. And they wrote what became a notorious or famous article in which they argued about the Israel lobby having too much power in the United States and blaming the Israel lobby not only for U.S. policy in the occupied territories, but blaming the Israel lobby for the U.S. war against Iraq. And the question that's being asked of me is, what's my opinion? I have to always preface my opinion by saying that John Mearsheimer was extremely supportive of me during my difficulties last year at my university, and so I have to always acknowledge his generosity and be clear that there's no personal animus or a political animus. There's just a question of a difference of opinion. The record, in my opinion, shows that when you stick to the narrow question of the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's probably true that it's the Israel lobby which accounts for U.S. policy. Because in a moment's reflection, you ask yourself, what does the U.S. stand to gain from Israel's occupation of the West Bank? What does it stand to gain from the settlements? What does it stand to gain from the colonial expansion? The answer obviously is zero. And since there are no fundamental U.S. interests at stake, I think the answer is it's the Israel lobby which shapes U.S. policy when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. However, when you get into the broader issue of the whole Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, where fundamental U.S. interests are at stake, the claim that Israel is determining those interests, in my opinion, it's not only not tenable at a theoretical level, there is zero, precisely zero, evidence at a factual level for that claim. So let's just quickly take the case of Iraq. I know it's a little bit of a digression, but people are interested on the question of Iraq and the role of the Israel lobby. So let's look at it very briefly. Anyone who's studied or familiar, and everyone in this room is, with the process leading up to the war in Iraq, there is no dispute whatsoever that the main architects of the war were Cheney and Rumsfeld. Is there any disagreement in this room? You know, Bush, okay, he was in his room with his PlayStation 3. He's not a real factor. But Rumsfeld and Cheney, they're the main architects of the war. About that, there's no serious dispute in the scholarly literature that's available. Well, say what you want about Rumsfeld and Cheney, but members of the Israel lobby, they plainly are not. And Rumsfeld and Cheney, I think it's fairly obvious that when they make calculations, they're calculating on what's good for the U.S. national interest as they interpret it. But is there anyone in this room who seriously believes Mr. Rumsfeld and Mr. Cheney, when they made their calculations in the build-up to the war in Iraq, were putting Israel's interests first? Does that sound like Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld? No. So how does Walter Mearsheimer try to finesse this obvious problem? They say, well, those people second in line, Libby, Feith, Wolfowitz, that they tricked Rumsfeld and Cheney. And Libby, Feith, Wolfowitz, Shulsky, and they name all the Jews, that they had been working for Israel, and they deceived Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld. Now again, I ask you a simple question. You don't have to have a doctorate from an elite university to answer these questions. There are many things you could say about Mr. Cheney. Murderer, thug. I'll go there with you. but gullible? No. Mr. Cheney, for better or for worse, is a very shrewd, smart man. He is not going to be tricked by Mr. Libby or Mr. Feith. And then Mr. Waldheimer and Mearsheimer and Walt, they say that these agents of Israel, Feith, Libby, Wolfowitz, and the rest, they say they were obviously agents of Israel, because Mearsheimer and Walt say, look at the policies they're advocating. These policies obviously serve Israel's national interest and not the American national interest. So now you're stuck with another problem. Wolfowitz, Feith, Libby, they've been working with Cheney and Rumsfeld for 30 years. Mr. Wolfowitz worked right under Cheney in 1980 in the Reagan administration. They know each other intimately. They know their politics, their allegiances. It's a 30-year relationship. Does it make any sense to anyone in this room that Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld are going to staff all the most strategic positions in the Defense Department and in the Vice President's office with open agents of a foreign government? Is that plausible? Is that credible? Is that believable? The moment you strip away, with no animus intended, but you strip away the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of footnotes in the book version of their article, which I've read several times, and you just look at the stark argument, the stark thesis, it just makes no sense. It's not believable. Unless you want to believe that Cheney and Rumsfeld were also secret agents of Israel. And then you enter into a realm of fantasy and paranoia. I just can't go there. That's, Spitzer being framed by Israel territory. I can't go there. Yes.
Next question. You obviously enjoying what you're doing, and you establish various sources that you build support for.
Was going to attack Israel. How do we know that? It's very easy to check. You shouldn't take my word. I agree with you. I'm from the 1960s. I like the button we used to wear, question authority. And you shouldn't take my word for it. Let's see what the record shows. You're going to have to allow me to finish. I want to go through the record for the audience quickly.
The Straits of Thailand.
Okay, allow me to finish. No, he could stand. There's no antagonism. We're just going to try to find the truth. Number one, in June 1st of 1967, Meir Amit, he was the head of Israel's Mossad at the time. Meir Amit, he comes to Washington, and he discusses what's happening with the Israeli conflict with Egypt. The United States had about 6 different intelligence agencies looking into what will Nasser do. And the Israelis keep coming to Washington, and they keep checking with their intelligence agencies. March 25th, March 26th, and you can read the whole record. Each time President Johnson, he asks them, the intelligence agencies, well, what's Egypt going to do? And the intelligence agencies come back and say, he's not going to attack. And then they say, and even if on the remote possibility that he does attack, Johnson says, quote, our intelligence